Good morning. Hi, guys. So I'm going to show you some work about landscapes, interiors, and still lifes. And I'm going to start here. So the first slide I'm showing you here is a slide I've shown you before. It's actually one of the first successful photographs ever taken by Louis Daguerre. So it's a daguerreotype, and of course, it's a still life. Part of the reason why it's a still life is that these the exposure times that were needed to create an image were very long, so having things that weren't moving were useful. But the other reason is because it was what art was like at the time. People were creating paintings that looked more like this, with exotic fruit and flowers. This is a photograph by Roger Fenton, who you will probably remember was photographed the Crimean War, and I'll show you some of that in a minute. This image is called Fruit and Flowers. It's the prominent roses and lilies allude to the sacred. They're both associated with the Virgin Mary, and the myriad of wine references, such as the grapes and the chalice, that are decorated here. And the impish figure over here in the corner. The physical attributes link him to the Bacchanalian Roman festival, so the festivals of just getting drunk and excess. So it points to the profane. But at the same time, the withering rose that you see right here, with the drooping leaves and tired-looking plums, which are down here, remind the viewer that such pleasures are ephemeral and fleeting. So he did a number of these still lives with a lot of metaphorical meaning. Exotic fruits, with different little sculptures involved, chalices, a lot of abundance, but like you see here, the food that's cut into. And all of this is exactly going back to the painting at the time. These two images were made the same year. This is Lily Martin Spencer in 1860. So still in the birth of photography, but they're doing much of the same things. This is another Roger Fenton photograph, which you probably will remember. It's titled The Valley of the Shadow of Death, which was photographed during the Crimean War. Again, exposure times were still too long to photograph action, so he's using landscape and what is happening in the landscape to depict a version of the horrors of war by having all these cannonballs splayed about. And so much of the images of the Crimean War, especially, are these sort of long views of what's happening. So ships in the harbor, the sort of the encampments, the soldier encampments, but not really alluding much to the horrors of what was actually happening during the Crimean War. The Crimean War was a terrible war, which was very mismanaged, and there was a lot of cholera. There was sickness that was happening because they weren't prepared for the weather. But these images don't really show that. Which, a couple years later, you get to the Civil War. This is photographed by Alexander Gardner called "The Dead of Antietam." And what Gardner and Timothy O'Sullivan did, this is a Timothy O'Sullivan photograph, they were both working for Matthew Brady, who was a prominent portrait photographer from New York City, who is often credited with photographing the Civil War, but in fact it was mostly shot by his employees, Alexander Gardner and O'Sullivan and a couple others. But what they do is they go into the battlefield after people have died and photograph the true horrors of war, the body count. And here you have the Battle of Antietam was one of the major battles in the country, and here you have all of these soldiers dead and lying around. Similarly here, dead Confederate soldiers at the scene of Ewell's attack near the Spotsylvania courthouse in Virginia. And this is Timothy O'Sullivan, the Battle of Gettysburg, of course, one of the most famous battles in the Civil War in 1863, using sort of the basic principles of landscape, where you have foreground, midground, background, horizon. You get this story with the people out of focus on the background, but these dead lying up front, as if they're part of the landscape. So O'Sullivan, unlike some other people that were in the war, when the war ends, he rejects going back to just being a portrait photographer, and he heads out west. So in 1849, there's the gold rush right before the Civil War, which kind of gets put on hold during the Civil War. And then after the war, there's the westward expansion. And there's this move to go out west. So Timothy O'Sullivan, there he is standing by a tree, goes to photograph out west and the grandeur of the open space. He's photographing the ancient ruins of this is the Pueblo, as well as this is Shoshone Falls. So these epic landscapes that are really bringing up the issue of the sublime and how we are lesser than. The true meaning of sublime is that it's this fear of God. That's what it actually means, and that's what these images are doing, where we become so small and insignificant amongst the landscapes. Oops, sorry. Another person who's doing this is Carlton E. Watkins, who focuses his camera on Yosemite. And in July of 1861, he made the decision that changed his career, where he traveled to Yosemite, where he brought a mammoth plate camera, which is used a camera that actually used a negative, which was 18 by 22 inches, so you can imagine the size of that, and a stereoscopic camera, meaning that it had two lenses that when you photographed, you could almost see a third dimension in the image that was made. But he made 30 plates and 100 stereos views in Yosemite, and these were some of the first photographs that were ever taken in Yosemite that were seen in the East. So you got it in 1864. The West in California was pretty sparsely populated, if at all. And the East had no idea that this existed. So these were sent back to places like New York and Boston, and showed people what it looked like out there for the first time. And in 1864, Watkins was hired to make more photographs of Yosemite for the California State Geological Survey. He often photographed Yosemite, and he had a profound influence over politicians to debate its preservation as a national park. And so 1860, his photographs did more than just capture the national park. It created an icon, and that's what this is. This is Half Dome, which is a major cliff. It already existed, obviously. It's a geological thing. But Watkins' photographs brought it to the people in a way that they could experience it if they couldn't get out there. It became iconic through his photographs and became something people wanted to see in person. So people then would start to try and make their ways out there. His images had a more concrete impact on Yosemite becoming a national park than just encouraging people to visit. It's said that the Senator John Conness, he passed Watkins' photographs around Congress, and his photography was also said to have influenced President Lincoln, and was one of the major factors in Lincoln signing the Yosemite Grant in 1864, which was a bill that declared Yosemite Valley inviolable, which means that it was protected. The bill paved the way for the 1872 creation of Yellowstone National Park and the U.S. National Park System, so across the United States. And one of Yosemite's many mountains is named Mount Watkins in honor of Watkins and his part in preserving the valley. And all of this is stuff that Trump is trying to ease back and take away from the world. More views of Yosemite. And as we go through this all, we come to a more contemporary photographer, Sally Mann, who is working today. She lives in rural Virginia, and she's been working steadily since the 80s, and in fact went to Bennington College and Putney for high school, so she has roots here. But she was started making images. She became very interested in what the landscape held, and so she started making images at one point of these are old Civil War battlefields, and so these thinking about what the landscape has seen and these sort of horrors that the landscape has been through and how that translates now years later. She's using an antiquated process, the wet plate collodion process, which gives you these sort of errors that she's using in the images, these moments that are failing, to help sort of give these landscapes this sort of eerie quality, where things become mass graves. You can almost feel the battles that might have happened there. She also, being from the south, then turns her camera to the south. And while some of these are battlefields, perhaps a bullet wounded tree, it's also about the sort of sultry quality of that humid air that you would get in a place like, Savannah, Georgia, or Mississippi, where you can sort of feel the sweat and that Spanish moss on the trees, through the ruins and the kudzu. This is Marcus Deciano, who's actually a Marlborough alum, for my students who are watching this from Marlborough. And Marcus is a really smart guy, way smarter than me, but what he's able to do is he's actually hacked into surveillance cameras throughout the country, and he's taking landscapes through these surveillance cameras that he's able to hack into. And in doing so, they have kind of this lower quality and sort of a almost, the roughness to them creates an homage back to these people like Carleton Watkins, who are making these images back then with antiquated processes, but he's using high-tech cameras that are all over the country to photograph. Like an image like this is pretty reminiscent of the Roger Fenton photograph that I showed you, The Valley of the Shadow of Death. So he's very, very consciously creating an art historical reference through very modern and skillful techniques. Which leads us to Ansel Adams, perhaps the most known photographer in the history of photography. His work is in every dentist office you've ever been to. It's very easily obtainable. Lots of coffee table books, and the reason for it is that their pictures are gorgeous. They're lush. They're very the depth of his printing is amazing. He actually came up with a technique called the zone system with Frederick Archer. I think I have that right. In which he's looking at a gradient. So he also is photographing in Yosemite, following in Carleton U. Watkins' footsteps. He became interested in this when he went on a trip with his family when he was 12. He was born in, I think, 1902. So later than Carleton U. Watkins, but he's photographing these same places that we just saw. But he also creates he's from San Francisco or the Carmel Valley, and helps to form this group called the Group F64. Of course, F64 is referring to the f-stop, and if you think about that, the f-stop F64, which most of your cameras don't even go to, is an incredibly deep depth of field, right? It's meaning that everything is in focus, everything is sharp. So really shying away from the sort of pictorial views that you might have had, going direct into the grandeur of it all. He worked for a while for the Sierra Club doing this, and the same thing happened. So he's working in the 20th century, and that similar thing where these are protected lands, but people are still, it's hard to travel, especially in the 30s and 40s, when he's really making a lot of this work. And he's bringing this back, but of course travel is now more accessible than it was during Carleton Watkins' era. And so people start going to these places. So his version of this was to protect the landscape, and it sort of had the opposite effect, where people started to vacation to Yosemite and other parks a lot more after seeing these photographs, which in turn brought a lot more destruction. And so after a period of time, there was more protections put in place than even Carleton Watkins had done with Ansel Adams' photographs. So even though at this sort of moment in history, sometimes we look at these Ansel Adams photographs as, you know, cliche or, only meant for waiting rooms. They, in fact, had a lot of political sway. And another member of the F-64 group is Edward Weston, who is working in a different way, where he's really working in this. He doesn't really care about his subject matter. He says he doesn't. He's working on the principle of, I'm going to forget the philosopher's name, but there's a very popular philosophy about at the time about the life force and thinking about the life force in everything. So he's making landscapes. He's from Carmel Valley, California. He's making these landscapes where you can see he's much more interested, less about the physical space and more about the textures and shapes and shadows. So much so that sometimes you don't know if you're looking at a landscape or a body. So he goes back and forth between photographing landscapes, bodies, and still lifes, and using the body as a landscape. Although obviously it's a nude, and there's questions about his own misogyny, but these images are about the textures, the space, and even in the nudes, about where you have the shadows curling around and these sort of organic shapes, which he applies the same principles to when he's working on still lifes. And this is, of course, this pepper of his, which is also one of the most famous photographs of all time. And looking for that life force, and where this simple pepper, the organic shapes of the twists and turns of the pepper, or the folds in the cabbage leaf, or how the light hits the separations in the shell, are not about the shell. The shell is inconsequential as much as it is about the shadow and shape of, say, a cabbage cut in half. Somebody who sort of takes off there is Minor White, who is really interested in the spiritual and the spiritual connection to nature. He uses sometimes a infrared film, and where you can see this sort of glowing quality here in the image of a house, where it becomes sort of more potent, or in a field, and that he's thinking about poetry and spirituality through all of this. And these simple landscapes of farms, but then also going into things where it's about the light and shadow, and how these shapes create other worlds, or abstractions even. Or perhaps the simplicity of just a bunch of tomatoes, or a reflection on a window, or frost on glass. Aaron Siskind is another photographer who's using, I guess you could say, still lives as abstractions. He got to get his start. He actually was in a group called the Photo League originally, which started in New York, which was working for social justice. He then moved to Chicago and worked at the Art Institute in Chicago before, and helping to found the program at RISD, where a lot of this work is made, where he's looking at the contrast in colors, pieces of signs, and textures of the man-made, to create new abstractions that are surprising and unexpected. Marie Kosindis is she actually died just a few years ago, and she was working in Boston, using a Polaroid film, which gives it this sort of vibrancy color, and she is using the kind of responding back to the art history of flowers, the metaphor of flowers, the folds in the fabric, the exotic vegetables with the figurines, and using all those tropes to create new work that has new meaning, like tarot cards and everything. This is work from the 60s, I believe. This is a picture that's out of place. Excuse me. So this is Marie Casindus. Barbara Bosworth, this last slide that was out of place, and this series, I have a couple series to show you. She's a contemporary photographer who teaches at Mass Art, was my teacher at Mass Art, a really lovely person who is very interested in nature. This first project is pretty straightforward, and it's called Champion Trees, and as you can see here, she's using 3 different exposures to create the spread of this tree. This tree is the champion trees. There's a list somewhere about what makes a champion tree, and it's in its own species. So there's a whole book just about which trees are the champion trees, meaning that they're the best tree of this kind. This project is called One Star and a Dark Voyage, in which she spent time out west, I believe in Montana, and her partner at the time was a hunter, and so you have these images of animals. There's really no pictures of people in here, and it's this story of hunting in the West, not being critical of, not making a judgment on the actual act of hunting, because her partner was a hunter who ended up, I think, taking his own life. And so the work itself is much more about the story and the poetry of what the landscape was like with this person and without this person. So both in sort of response to losing someone, as well as in response to loving someone. I'm showing you some landscapes that have people, and of course landscapes or animals, and or still lives that have animals, and how does that relate to this idea of what landscape or still life are. This other project is called Natural Histories. She's from outside of Cincinnati, and she's photographing. This is a project she made while her parents were aging, and photographing her life there. Very interested in the natural world surrounding them. This is the landscape that she grew up in, and in a slide like this, you see all these little green dots here, and what those all are it's a long exposure, and those are all fireflies, and every time they emit their bioluminescence, it gives a little spot about where they landed. And so in this work, you really see the poetic, how one image leads to the next, and how they speak to each other about a sense of place, a sense of belonging. More fireflies, and even more fireflies. And this is a landscape. This is called an eclipse in my father's hands. And so even though you could argue it's a portrait, it's also a photograph of the sun. This is a project by Laura McPhee, who also teaches at Mass Art. It's called River of No Return. And she went west from Massachusetts to trace her grandmother's youth. And along the way, she fell in love with this ranch land and the wilderness and its inhabitants at 7,000 feet. So she's going out in June when Boston is incredibly humid and hot. The 4th of July ranch, which is where she is getting a dusting of snow, as seen in this picture. She's the daughter of John McPhee, who's a Pulitzer Prize-winning author, and her 2 sisters are also writers. And she somehow ended up as a photographer, but she says that story is first and foremost in her work, and that impulse is part of her family trait. So there are portraits in this work that I'm showing you. This was this girl the daughter of these people who lived on the 4th of July ranch. Her name's Maddie, and so she started photographing Maddie when she was 13, So who's this young girl living at this high altitude in the Sawtooth Valley in Idaho. Um, the nearest town, Stanley, was nestled in a land so rugged that it's one of the only few areas in the continental U.S. that could support wild grizzly bears. Um, and Maddie's parents are wildlife biologists, and the caretakers of this ranch. And she was, because it was an hour-long bus ride into school and the winter travel, she's homeschooled. And so she becomes sort of the main character in this story that is landscaped. You see here a car that traveled through. And Maddie keeps on showing up with different versions of birds or pretend or the character of that sort of emits outside of the landscape. And we see the changing of the seasons through this fence, the way of life through hunting. So Laura McPhee was given a residency, the Alturas Foundation residency in 2003, and that's how she ended up here. She was offered a cabin on this ranch, and what she said, but going into it, was that she might not even make any photographs. She was kind of upset, or was confused at least, by the lineage of photography in the American West. It was too intimidating to think of people like Timothy O'Sullivan and Ansel Adams and how to sort of place herself in that canon. But when she got to Sawtooth Valley, she saw a sign marking the Salmon River as the headwaters, and it said River of No Return. And before she even took one photograph, she thought that would be a good name for the series. And so from there on, she decided that she had to make the work. A year later, in 2004, she became friends with the caretakers on the neighboring ranch and with Maddie and her parents. And so much of this is landscape as story, and how this narrative comes together. And the book is really a lovely piece of work. Emmett Gowan, who is somebody I've shown you before, he was known for taking pictures of his wife and family. His wife Enid. I've shown a number of these photographs, but in this series, it's called Changing the Earth, and he's photographing the world from above. So he started it in 1986. And he was started by photographing, recording images of military test sites and missile silos, ammunition storage and disposal facilities, coal mining, pivot irrigation, and off-road motor traffic, and more. He returned in. He flew over the Hanford Nuclear Reservation, which revealed a pattern of relationships and a dark history of a place and events that altered his perception of the age in which he lived. And after his first photograph of this abandoned nuclear reactor site, it went from there to include these human tracks. He said, "The one thing I learned from my experience is that it's not some stranger doing this, destruction of the physical environment. When I look at the American landscape, I also feel with great sadness that we did this to ourselves." And so he's very critically looking at the landscape by producing these kind of gorgeous abstractions from aerial photographs. Somebody else who's working with aerial photography is David Mizell, and this series is called Oblivion, where he's photographing Los Angeles, and he's looking at the frenzy for the city to expand, that the city creates topographies of alienation, fear, and despair. He says, "Indeed, Los Angeles is emblematic of an idea of modern space that is linked to an increasing sense of collective societal anxiety. The amorphous skein of strip malls, gated developments, highway entrances, and exit ramps lays unfurled over the landscape like a sheet over a cadaver. Surely the earth is dead beneath the sheer weight and breadth of this built form." And he says, to continue. Is this the reason for the unease, the hint of claustrophobia and synesthetic terror that these pictures elicit? Or is it the endlessness of the expanse, the multiplying nothingness that fills frame after frame, the city metastasizing ceaselessly, which causes a sense of rising dread? And he would go on to do another project called Library of Dust. And in Library of Dust, it depicts individual copper canisters that each contain the cremated remains of patients from a state-run psychiatric hospital in, as you can see, Oregon, in Salem, Oregon. The patients would have died at the hospital somewhere between 1883 and the 1970s. So what the year that it opened, the facility opened, and to when it closed, and their bodies were just never claimed. And through this was always shown in a grid, but he's looking at the sort of beautiful oxidization that happens on these copper canisters. He said, my concerns with the Library of Dust are the crisis of representation that derive from attempts to index or archive the evidence of trauma, the uncanny ability of objects to portray such trauma, and the revelatory possibilities inherent in images of such traumatic disturbances. So similar to Emmett Gowan, these sort of abstractions of this object that is created through time and history, but also how trauma is there. Well, there are certainly physical and chemical explanations for the ways that these canisters transform over time. It also encourages us to consider what happens to our own bodies when we die, and to the souls that occupy them. This is Justin Kimball's work, Pieces of String, where he photographed in abandoned homes, hotels, and buildings throughout the northeastern United States. From his brother Doug is an auctioneer and would be hired to clean out houses after people died or places were abandoned. So he would go with him and photograph the things that were left behind and the traces of humanity that lay there. So while Doug was clearing these spaces, looking for items of potential use to auction off later, Justin he sought within them the evidence of an individual's life, and so these moments of pieces of people that were still there, and how you see into these spaces that someone lived in. So he would look for the smallest objects, note a box of hairpins or a stain on a pillow, and he reimagines the existence and relationship to the absent owners. And for my GCC students, a lot of this is photographed right around here, as you'll see, the Greenfield Recorder. A lot of this is our houses in Greenfield and nearby. Justin says, I use the camera's descriptive power and the photographic illusion of truth to create the narrative and inspire feelings about its subject. The resulting photographs are my perception of what happened in those spaces, who lived there, what was hidden, and what was seen. This series is Todd Heido's series, House Hunting. It's right now he's actually posting a lot of this work on Instagram as a way to sort of think about what it means to be isolated and alone. But what he's doing is mostly in San Francisco and actually some in Ohio. He's looking at this lonely, forlorn, mysterious, but somehow strangely comforting version of the suburbs, where you have, it's slightly voyeuristic, these houses at night whose habitation is suggested by the glow of a television set or an unseen overhead bulb. And as we walk the streets with him. Todd Heido manages to turn the banal into something beautiful, imbuing his images with soft pastels and allowing the exteriors to glow in the cool evening air. I'm going to show you two projects from Richard Mizrak. The first one is called On the Beach. And in this work, Mizrak is honing in on the delicate relationship to the sea. Using this, and this really is a book that needs to be seen. It's a massive, massive book. I think it's 16 by 20 inches. But he's using this gorgeous, slowly shifting color palette where the blues of the water change and you get tones of the sand. And it changes the depth and tide and the abstract patterns of waves and rippling water and the beaches that are both empty and cluttered, to a couple of people kissing, or the loneliness of a sunbather. He carefully balances the minutiae of human gesture against the massive scale of the sea. And in some images, you'll see a lone figure floating in a liquid field of brilliant turquoise, or in other lies beached and partially buried. So it's about landscape and how we inhabit landscape. And he has this other project, an ongoing project called the Desert Cantos, and he's still an ongoing project, but the one I'm going to show you is Canto number 3, The Flood, which is all photographed in the Salton Sea, which is sort of near Palm Springs in California, which is a very strange area that was trying to be this man-made utopia that failed in the desert and it floods and all that stuff. But with an eye attuned to color and a belief in the power of aesthetics to effect change, Mizrak has made lush, beautiful photographs of often terrible subjects. And so you see here these flooded and abandoned spaces. The Salton Sea, it was a lake that was created by an engineering mistake at the beginning of the 20th century. The lake was stocked with fish in the 50s to promote tourism, but became permanently flooded a few decades later, leaving odd and often ironic reminders of human folly poking out of the water. The fish are in the picture, but they experience summer die-off due to the warming of the salty water and the choking algae blooms, so that this area smells like rotten fish. With biblical overtones of the apocalypse, Mizrak he's expanding the landscape tradition from a depiction of the picturesque to an expression of political engagement. The next photographer I'm showing you is Andreas Gursky, a German photographer who he's known for using elevated vantage point as his main perspective, and it allows the audience to view the scenes from a place that is both peripheral and central. He uses subject to create an unconventional geometry and organizes the world fitting in with a personal visual logic. In 1990, he began this project of photographing, stock exchanges, and he's continued it throughout his career. So going all over to different stock exchanges all over the world, in North Korea, as well as going to concerts and sporting events and other events that are crammed full of people, and creating these almost abstractions of the space using the colors or lack of colors in the Saudi Arabian stock exchange. He's most known for photographing these very strict landscapes. This is a hotel, and he does use digital manipulation to push forth these sort of ever and infinite expanses. So he uses images from nature to cities, crowds, commercial products, but he's inventing new worlds from existing elements, constructing tableaus based on his methodical observations and using a large format camera, high definition photographs. He presents hyper-focused scenes that that privilege neither foreground or background, which gives us this sort of unsettling feeling of being lost in the landscape. This image, Rhine number 2, in 2011 set a record for the highest price paid for a single photograph, and when it sold for $4.3 million. And these images are massive, massive, massive images, so you really feel less than. And so through sort of really pristine digital work, he is painstakingly compositing new and confusing landscapes. This is Daniel Gordon, whose work is positioned somewhere between still life and constructed reality. He's a young contemporary photographer, and so there's also, when we talk about collage, his work comes into collage. And what he does is he actually mines the internet for images of, say, a pineapple, and creates a three-dimensional space out of printed out and recolored images that he's taking from the internet to create what is, in effect, a three-dimensional still life, then flattening it down to the second dimension of photography. It says it involves creating figurative tableaus from cut paper and cut out images that he then photographs. And in addition, he seems motivated by a deeply felt obsession with the human body and the discomforts of having one. This is Jessica Eaton, who is a younger photographer working. You'll see these are works that are painstakingly created using the scientific effects of light. So these are all straight photographs. There's no digital manipulation, and she's using light to change it. So she is using the medium of photography itself as her subject. How light interacts with itself on a subject, how prisms work and how they create light, or how light crosses itself and creates new patterns. So using an innovative and technically exacting analog methods, she's producing alternate visions of reality, capturing images that the naked eye could never perceive. Her work is exploring the limits of vision using, as well as its speculative frontiers. So this is all, the way an image like this is taken on film is through exacting patterns of light. So she's creating this plaid pattern, and you can see where it crosses and creates mixed light and all of that. But the setup itself is just this white painted cube on a white backdrop. These next couple of images are by John Chiara, who's a artist working in the San Francisco area, and these are pinhole images, meaning that he's just using a camera obscura to make these. They're massive, huge, large images, so they are unique. They are only one of a kind because the image is directly photographed onto the paper that he's using, and the camera that he's using, which is the most impressive part of this, is about the size of a small boat. He actually has to park it in a boatyard. And in order to take these photographs, he has to physically be inside the camera. So there are times when you'll see a sweat mark that disrupts where the chemical will reach when he develops it, creating these sort of an homage to those past processes. This is Joe Johnson's work, which is a series of city skylines, Boston city skylines at night. So using the skyline as a way to look at geometric forms and create that evening light, the long exposure to create that glow, very sharp with a lot of mixed light colors, unique colors, traces of humanity throughout it, but you'll never see really people in it apart from one leg. And it's a way to sort of abstract and revision the city. There's my leg. Not my leg. So these next few are some of the more this in the contemporary world, some really big names that are still prevalent, but really born out of the late 60s and 70s. This first person I'm showing you is Joel Sternfeld, and this is his project American Prospects. They were taken throughout the United States between 1977 and 1988. This is, at the Hoover Dam. And he's looking at the changes in the American landscape. So especially in the early 70s, late 60s, this sprawl, new construction. This is a mudslide in Southern California. He's using a large format 8x10 camera that he had to mount on a tripod. So unlike other at this time, a lot of photographers were really interested in using small cameras, really quick street work, and he was slowing down. He wanted to break away from the generic street photography that he'd seen in New York of people like Winogrand and any number of people. And so he was hoping to get a more complex vision of the country through slowing down. He pursued that through these large-scale color prints that appear to be more detailed than the traditional black and white photos that at the time we were used to. Another person who's working, so I don't know why this isn't the first slide. Sorry about this. This is Louis Baltz, who was part of this group called the New Topographics. And the New Topographics was actually a show that happened in the late 60s, early 70s. I don't have the date here. But it happened at the George Eastman House in Rochester. And it was a bunch of young photographers, all white men, that was looking at a radical shift from the traditional depictions of landscape. The common subjects were views of a stark industrial landscape, suburban sprawl, and urban desolation. So just what I was saying is sort of, Joel Sternfeld was not part of that, but the idea of this changing landscape of the American culture. There was no ideal image of nature in the New Topographics, but a plain, unemotional documentation of the way man has come to alter it. And so in Louis Baltz's work, we see a lot of these empty, sort of industrial spaces. This body of work focused on the search for beauty and bleakness and devastation. So organizing the space to find beauty, a reflection of human control and power through the depiction of common architecture, of factories, parking lots, and offices. So very few touches of humanity in these spaces that are built by humans. Another member that was part of this show is Robert Adams, and this work is actually not part of it, just because I wanted to change it. But this is a project that he did called Summer Nights, and it was really just about the joy of walking on a summer night and the air and seeing the world sort of fresh and warmly. So it's a very positive project, similar to Todd Hido's piece, his house hunting project, but also very different in that it doesn't resonate the loneliness, the sense of isolation. It actually feels very sort of grounded in the world and with people, even though there are no people. Maybe except for that. No, it's like one person right there. Long views of a place, but not necessarily lonely. And the final person I'll show you today is Stephen Shore, and this is his sort of his first project that he ever really did, called American Surfaces, and it's all a road trip. His idea was to keep a visual diary of the meals he ate, the people he met, televisions he watched, motel rooms that he would sleep in, toilets he used, as well as the towns he would drive through. And in this visual diary and series of repeated subjects, he would build kind of a cultural picture of the country at the time. This is also part of the New Topographics. So you have campsites, these televisions. He says, I had something else in mind at the same time, which was I wanted to take pictures that felt natural. I think everyone is familiar with the fact that they often write in a different way than they speak, and that their writing can sometimes seem more stilted and even use a different vocabulary. And I wanted pictures that felt as natural as speaking. So almost diving deep into the snapshot aesthetic and the curiosities that he sees. At random moments, when he thought of it, he would take what we might call today a screenshot. But you can call whatever. It's whatever was in his vision, whatever he was looking at, and that was the experience of what was that experience of looking like. So a TV dinner on an old stove, and he would use that as a reference of how to make a picture, rather than the more conventional language about a picture is supposed to be constructed. This work was first shown in the fall of 1972, and the pictures were shown just um, in a grid. They were shown in a grid, 3 rows high. They were just pasted to the walls and not behind glass because he wanted people to see them as small snapshot prints. It was important that they had that vernacular that was becoming so part of the culture of taking photographs and having stacks of photographs. And it was fascinated by the color and the palette. So really, this is early color work. People weren't really using color, and that became, he really wanted to show why that was important. And that is the end of the show. So I hope you enjoy it, and remember to send me your questions and comments, and I'll do my best to answer all of them. I hope this is helpful as you start working on your own projects about landscapes, still lifes, and interiors, and we'll talk next week. All right, see ya.